Americans. In his letter to America, Osama Bin Laden claimed that this is one of the... Adjusted for inflation, the United States has provided Israel with over $250 billion, $233.7 billion since the country was founded in 1948, making it the largest recipient of U.S. economic and military assistance since World War II. On average, Israel annually receives more than $4.3 billion in foreign assistance, about 2% of Israel's GDP. In recent years, military aid accounts for 75% of taxpayer money sent to Israel. You can't morally force people to... Anyway. U.S. support for Israel has been one of the main drivers behind Muslim hostility towards Americans. In his letter to America, Osama Bin Laden claimed that this is one of the main reasons behind the 9/11 attack. He wrote, "The British handed over Palestine with your help and your support to the Jews who have occupied it for more than 50 years. Years overflowing with oppression, tyranny, crimes, killing, expulsion, destruction, and devastation. The creation and continuation of Israel is one of the greatest crimes, and you are the leaders of its criminals." This was Osama bin Laden's letter to America. So, now we go to history and philosophy conclusion land, and I hope that it's of some value to you, and thank you, of course, for watching through the presentation. By North African Muslim pirates. It's a power slave trade going to the Muslim countries. So the death toll from 1472, let's stop attacking everyone who shows the first sign of conscience and better behavior in the world and only ascribe the blame to them. Let's not look at European guilt as a mineable resource which you can squeeze with state power to produce the diamonds of fiscal transfers. Hi everybody, Stefan Molyneux from Freedom Main Radio. I hope you're doing well. This is the truth about slavery. Now, why are we even going to talk about such an ancient and evil institution? Well, we really don't understand the history of slavery. We cannot identify its causes, and we therefore have a very tough time fighting its echoes and remnants in the here and now. And I would really like to make the case that we can put an end to human slavery once and for all, but first of all, we have to understand what it is and where it came from. So let's dive in, shall we? Thank you so much for your time. So the history of slavery. Slavery is an ancient institution common to all cultures throughout history up until the 19th century, and in many places into the 20th and 21st century. How did you become a slave? Well, you became an insolvent debtor, ran out of money. You were sold into slavery by your parents, or you were born to slave parents a lot of times, or you were captured through kidnapping by slave raiders and pirates, particularly the Barbary Coast. Slave dealing was an accepted way of life throughout all of human history, fully established in all societies, unopposed by religion, in fact, almost always supported by religion. Christians supported slavery through the Old Testament. Muslims supported slavery explicitly, and the Jews supported slavery, ran a lot of the slave trade. Now, a lot of the slaves in the world throughout history were white people or Europeans. In fact, the very word slave comes from Slav, or people of Eastern Europe. Now, the people from Eastern Europe, the reason why Slav became slave was because for thousands of years they were subjected to every conqueror who swept through the region. Celts, Greeks, Romans, barbarians, or the Conans. The ancient Greeks, who a lot of Westerners get culture, art, music, and philosophy from, were utterly dependent on slavery. Plato's Republic, one of the first blueprints for fascistic totalitarianism in the history of the world, was firmly based on slave labor. Plato himself said that owning 50 or more slaves represented the possessions of a wealthy man. Under Roman law, rebellions against your slave owners were kind of discouraged. So if your slave owner was ever found killed, all of the slaves, all of you would be put to death. There was one Roman slave owner who was found murdered, and 400 of his slaves were put to death. So a little tough to get out of the institution. 0 AD, or when Christ was born, half of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. 3/4 of the population of Athens were slaves. Now, not really known very often, up to 1/2 or more of the arrivals in the American colonies early on were white slaves. We'll get into that a little bit later. They were slaves for life. Generally, the slavery was hereditary. Some of them were called indentured servants, so they would sign up or be kidnapped and sold into bondage. Yet these contracts were generally extended at will. Nobody was really there to enforce them. It was rare in America to own slaves. At the very peak of black slavery in America, only 6% of Southern whites owned slaves. This, of course, would be the richest 6%, and we'll get into how they used the state to maintain slavery in a few minutes. So if you include all the white people in the North, at the very height of slavery, only 1.4% of white Americans owned black slaves. Monstrous, immoral. That was the truly evil 1% of the day. Slavery was, of course, indigenous to African and Arab countries before it made its way to Europe. Slavery was widely practiced by the tribes of American Indians long before Columbus came to the New World. Ethiopia had slavery until 1942, Saudi Arabia until 1962, Peru until 68, India until 76, and Mauritania until 1980. Also coming a tad late to the anti-slavery party was the Catholic Church, because certain passages in the Old Testament sanctioned slavery. The New Testament didn't give any clear teachings to abolish it. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council declared without qualification that slavery was an infamy that dishonored the Creator and was a poison in society. To be fair, Christians, theologians mostly followed St. Augustine in arguing that slaves should be treated well, and they did discourage the owning of Christian slaves. Blacks owned slaves, even in America. According to the United States Census of 1830, in just the one town of Charleston, South Carolina, 407 black Americans owned slaves themselves. One study has concluded that 28% of free blacks owned slaves, which is far higher than the free whites who owned slaves. It was a lot of a class thing. I mean, the rich whites would own slaves. The poor whites hated slavery and hated the institution for a variety of reasons we'll get into, not least of which was the fact that it drove down the price of labor to the point where they found it almost impossible to compete. Now, what are some of the myths? Well, slavery is often portrayed as a free market phenomenon that had to be ended by governments. But the reality is there were, in fact, only 2 countries in the history of the world that found it necessary to end, or at least attempt to end, slavery through civil war. One was the United States of America, and the other was Haiti. Of course, the Civil War, as we'll get to in the next presentation, the truth about Abraham Lincoln, didn't really have anything to do with slavery, but had more economic motives. So slavery was a worldwide phenomenon that existed from prehistory until the 18th and 19th centuries, when Western powers, in particular England, ended it as a moral crusade. Now, why were so many Africans enslaved? Well, one of the reasons was because the African rulers within Africa, particularly in southern middle Africa, were endlessly warring against each other, civil wars and so on. They would capture slaves, they would bring them to the seaports where the Europeans and the Arabs would pick them up. Some Arabs went inland. But you couldn't, as a white person, you couldn't go into Africa. I mean, the average life expectancy for a white person going to Africa was 11 months. You just get downed by big and small animals, lions or bugs of various kinds, cholera and so on. So they had to get caught by the black rulers, and then they would be shipped off to the ports where they'd be picked up by the Arabs and the Europeans. England, as a moral crusade led by a man we'll meet in a moment, was ended by attacking the slave ships, agitating for the removal of government support for slavery, which is really essential, and bribing slave owners to release their slaves or buying their property. Of course, you can't, under common law, retroactive law is not valid. I can't say something was illegal 5 years ago and charge you for that. So what was legitimate property had to be bought, and the British government did spend a lot of blood and treasure trying to end slavery. So, I mean, this is one of the great misconceptions of history. So, Western Europeans were very late to the party. The Muslim slave trade went on for 1,400 years. The Christian slave trade went on for a few hundred years. They were late to the party. They took very few of the slaves, as we'll see. They treated their slaves far better than what occurred in the Muslim countries, as we'll also see. So Europeans ended up fighting against slavery, Europeans ended slavery, and therefore you only ever hear Europeans being blamed for slavery. This is horribly unjust. Look, if we want to move the moral standard of mankind further up, which I think we all want to do, let's stop attacking everyone who shows the first sign of conscience and better behavior in the world and only ascribe the blame to them. Let's not look at European guilt as a mineable resource which you can squeeze with state power to produce the diamonds of fiscal transfers. So let's look at the Eastern trade. So you know about the Atlantic slave trade, I'm sure. What is the Eastern slave trade, which was the trans-Saharan slave trade going to the Muslim countries? So the death toll from 14 centuries of the Muslim slave trade in Africa is estimated at a little over 112 million people. And remember, this is a time when the world was quite a bit less populated, which had a lot to do with the Muslim slave trade and its excellence at depopulating and disassembling human beings. Historian Robert Davies estimates North African Muslim pirates abducted and enslaved more than 1 million Europeans between 1530 and 1780. 500,000 black African slaves ended up in North America. Twice that were kidnapped by... Historian Robert Davies estimates North African Muslim pirates abducted and enslaved more than 1 million Europeans between 1530 and 1780. 500,000 black African slaves, 1530 and 1780. 500,000 black African slaves ended up in North America, 1530 and 1780. 500,000 black African slaves ended up in North America. Twice that were kidnapped by North African Muslim pirates. It's a power differential. It's not a race thing, fundamentally. Slave 1530 and 1780. 500,000 black African slaves ended up in North America. Twice that were...
my name is Francis Bach.